By July of 1099, the men outside Jerusalem had crossed nearly 3,000 kilometers of hostile territory. They had survived ambushes, famine, disease, desertion, and a siege that had almost destroyed them. Most of the people who began the journey were gone. The survivors had eaten their animals and buried their friends. Now the city they had imagined in sermons, prayers, and dreams stood directly in front of them. But Jerusalem was not waiting to be rescued. Its walls were defended. The nearby water sources had been cut off. The summer heat was brutal. And somewhere in Egypt, a much larger army was preparing to march north. The Crusaders had little time, almost no supplies, and no single commander. Yet on the morning of July 15th, a wooden siege tower rolled toward the northern wall. Men climbed through smoke and arrows. A bridge dropped onto the battlements. Within hours, one of the most sacred cities on earth became the scene of one of the bloodiest victories of the Middle Ages. So the real question is not only how Jerusalem fell, it is how this divided, starving expedition reached it at all. To answer that, we have to return 4 years to an emperor losing his empire, a pope whose exact words were never recorded, and a rescue mission that became something no one could fully control. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire suffered a major defeat against the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert. The battle did not destroy the empire overnight, but the civil wars that followed opened much of Anatolia to Turkish conquest. By 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos needed experienced soldiers from the west. His request was limited. He wanted military help against the Turks. What Alexios expected was probably a manageable force of mercenaries or allied knights. What eventually arrived was a migration. Western Europe was growing. Its warriors troubled the church, and pilgrimage shaped Christian life. Above every destination stood Jerusalem, the city of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. The region was politically divided. The Seljuk world had splintered. Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul, and the Sultanate of Rum pursued their own interests, while Egypt belonged to the rival Fatimid Caliphate. There was no single Muslim power waiting in unity for an invasion. That division would become one of the Crusade's greatest advantages. Pope Urban II saw an opportunity. He could aid Byzantium, strengthen papal leadership, redirect knightly violence, and make Jerusalem the center of a far larger cause. Before we continue, my name is Noah. We've just launched this channel for people who love history, especially the stories that usually get reduced to a date and a single sentence. If that sounds like you, consider subscribing. It's free, and it helps us make better videos more than you might think. Alright, back to 1095. On November 27th, Pope Urban spoke to a crowd gathered at Clermont in central France. No transcript survives. Later chroniclers reconstructed the sermon, so its famous versions are memories shaped into legend. But the central message is clear. Urban called on Western Christians to go east, aid fellow Christians, confront the Turks, and liberate Jerusalem. The journey would also be an act of penance. For a medieval Christian, warfare, normally a source of sin, could now become a possible path toward salvation. Men began sewing crosses onto their clothing. To take the cross meant accepting a vow, a pilgrimage, and a military expedition at once. Their motives included faith, forgiveness, honor, adventure, and power. Participation was ruinously expensive. Families sold or mortgaged land to fund armor, horses, and years on the road. Urban expected the organized expedition to depart in the summer of 1096. But the idea spread faster than the Pope could control it. The first crowds moved east under Peter the Hermit. His people's crusade included experienced fighters, but lacked supplies, discipline, and unified command. Before the main armies had even departed, the movement had already turned its violence against people in Europe. In the Rhineland, crusading bands attacked Jewish communities in cities such as Worms and Mainz. Families were murdered, forced conversion was demanded, and property was seized. These were among the Crusade's earliest organized atrocities. Peter's followers eventually reached Constantinople. Alexios advised them to wait for the main armies, but they crossed into Asia Minor and began raiding near Nicaea. On October 21, 1096, the forces of Sultan Kili Arslan ambushed them near Civito. The People's Crusade collapsed. Only a small minority escaped. Kili Arslan had destroyed the first wave so easily that he learned the wrong lesson. He believed the Western invasion was noisy, divided, and easy to destroy. Behind the shattered survivors, however, the real armies were approaching. And this is where the expedition became even more dangerous. No king led the First Crusade. There was no supreme commander, no unified chain of command, and no agreement over who would own a conquered city. It was a coalition of rival princes. Raymond of Toulouse was wealthy and experienced. Godfrey of Bouillon would become its celebrated hero. Bohemond of Taranto was a brilliant Norman commander with old hostility toward Byzantium. And Baldwin was ready to turn pilgrimage into personal power. To reach Jerusalem, these men had to cooperate. To profit from victory, they had to compete. That contradiction followed them all the way to the Holy City. At Constantinople, Alexios demanded oaths. Most leaders promised to return former Byzantine territory. In exchange, he provided transport, guides, supplies, and military support. It was a partnership built on necessity and suspicion. In the spring of 1097, the armies crossed into Asia Minor and surrounded Nicaea. Kilij Arslan, still underestimating them, returned too late to save his capital. The city received supplies across a lake, so Alexios transported boats overland and launched them behind the walls. Nicaea surrendered to the Byzantines. Strategically, it was a success. Politically, it created resentment. Alexios prevented a sack, and many crusaders felt he had taken their victory and its rewards. Soon afterward, Kili Arslan attacked near Dorylaeum. Turkish horse archers surrounded Bohemond's division, firing and withdrawing for hours. Then banners appeared in the distance. Godfrey, Raymond, and the other leaders arrived. The crusaders counterattacked, and Kilij Arslan withdrew. The victory opened the road across Anatolia, but the land itself became the enemy. People collapsed from thirst, horses died, and every kilometer weakened the army. Meanwhile, Baldwin left the main route and moved east to Edessa. There, an Armenian ruler named Thoros adopted him as a son and co-ruler. Within weeks, Thoros was overthrown and killed. Baldwin took control. A pilgrim had become a prince. Edessa became the movement's first Latin state. Personal ambition had threatened the crusade, but also protected its eastern flank. Then the main army reached Antioch, a city so large it could not be completely surrounded, a fortress so strong it had rarely been taken by assault, and the place where victory would become a prison. The Crusaders spent 8 months trying to enter Antioch. When they finally succeeded, their victory lasted only 3 days. A much larger army was already marching toward them from Mosul. The walls they were desperate to breach would soon become the only walls keeping them alive. First, winter broke the army. Rain turned the camps to mud. Food disappeared. Horses starved. Disease spread. Men deserted. Relief forces came from Damascus and Aleppo, but the Crusaders defeated them separately. That word mattered. Separately. The rulers of northern Syria feared one another. The Crusaders were divided too, but immediate danger forced them to cooperate just long enough to survive. Bohemond then made contact with a tower commander inside Antioch. On the night of June 2, 1098, chosen men climbed the wall. A gate was opened, and the Crusaders flooded into the city. Antioch had fallen. But almost no food had been captured. The citadel remained in enemy hands, and within days, Kerboga of Mosul arrived with his coalition army. The besiegers became the besieged. Trapped inside a city filled with corpses and hunger, some crusaders escaped over the walls with ropes. Emperor Alexios was advancing with relief, but deserters convinced him Antioch was already lost. He turned back. To Byzantium, he had avoided a catastrophe. To the Crusaders, he had abandoned them. Their alliance would never recover. Then a poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew claimed that St. Andrew had revealed the location of the lance that pierced Christ's side. Men dug beneath a church floor. Peter entered the pit and produced a piece of iron. Some believed, others suspected fraud. But whether the relic was genuine was almost beside the point. Its effect was real. It gave a starving army a reason to believe that God had not abandoned it. On June 28th, the Crusaders marched out to fight. They were smaller, hungrier, and had far fewer horses than before. But Kerboga's coalition was fragile. Rival emirs distrusted his growing power. As the Crusaders advanced, parts of his army withdrew. The coalition broke. The Crusaders believed they had witnessed a miracle. The political reality was that their enemies had fractured at exactly the wrong moment. Both explanations shaped what happened next. The road to Jerusalem was open, but the leaders delayed for months while Bohemond claimed Antioch for himself. Ordinary Crusaders became furious. Their vow led to Jerusalem, not to another prince's new territory. By January of 1099, pressure from the rank and file forced the expedition south. The army was smaller, but hardened by 2 years of war. Local rulers often preferred negotiation to battle, offering food or money in exchange for being left alone. The Crusaders kept advancing partly because the powers in their path still feared one another more than they feared the Franks. And their final enemy had changed. While the Crusaders were trapped at Antioch, Egypt's Fatimids had taken Jerusalem from their Seljuk rivals. A campaign launched partly against Turkish expansion would end against a different Muslim power. On June 7, 1099, the survivors finally saw Jerusalem. The promise made at Clermont stood before them. So did a deadline. The Fatimid army in Egypt was coming. Jerusalem's governor had stockpiled food, controlled nearby water sources, and expelled many Eastern Christians from the city. The Crusaders had too few men to surround the walls, little water, and no secure supply line. Their first assault failed. Jerusalem could not be taken by devotion alone. Then Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa with sailors, craftsmen, tools, rope, and timber. Parts of the ships were dismantled and carried inland. The Crusaders built ladders, catapults, and siege towers. On July 8th, they fasted and walked barefoot around the city. The ritual gave a divided army one shared purpose before the final attack. Godfrey would strike from the north. Raymond would attack from the south. Then Godfrey made the decision that changed the battle. Under cover of darkness, his men dismantled their siege tower and moved it to a section the defenders had less time to reinforce. The final assault began on July 14th. By dawn on July 15th, Godfrey's tower had reached the wall. Fire and smoke drove defenders back. A bridge dropped onto the battlements. Men crossed, seized the wall, and opened a gate. The northern defense collapsed. In the south, the governor surrendered the citadel to Raymond in exchange for safe passage for himself and his garrison. For much of the population, there was no such protection. Crusader forces killed Muslim residents in streets, houses, and around the Temple Mount. Members of Jerusalem's Jewish community were also killed. The exact number of dead is unknowable, and medieval chroniclers used exaggerated biblical imagery. But the massacre was real and widespread. The conquerors then removed their armor and prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In their understanding, the impossible vow had been fulfilled. Yet the Crusades' central contradiction remained. A pilgrimage had ended in conquest, an act of penance had ended in massacre. And the campaign was not over. The army gathering in Egypt was now close. On August 12th, the Crusaders surprised the Fatimid force near Ascalon and defeated it before it could fully prepare. Most survivors then returned home. Their vow was complete. Godfrey governed Jerusalem. Bohemond held Antioch. Baldwin held Edessa. Pope Urban never learned that Jerusalem had fallen. He died before the news could reach Rome. So why did the First Crusade succeed? Byzantine transport and supplies carried its first phase. Armenian and other Eastern Christian communities provided local alliances. The Western armies adapted, and danger repeatedly forced their leaders to cooperate. Their opponents never faced them as one united force. Kilij Arslan underestimated them. The rulers of Syria acted separately. Kerboga's coalition collapsed. The Fatimids and Seljuks treated one another as rivals. And the Crusaders were sustained by a conviction impossible to measure, but impossible to ignore. They believed their suffering had sacred purpose. That belief did not prevent ambition, panic, betrayal, or cruelty. But it repeatedly persuaded survivors to continue when the rational choice was to go home. The First Crusade was not a simple collision between two united religions. It was a chain of bargains, rivalries, misunderstandings, faith, unexpected alliances, and extreme violence. And victory created a new question. How could a few thousand Western settlers hold a kingdom surrounded by enemies? That is where the story of the Crusader states and eventually the rise of Saladin begins. The First Crusade had answered how Jerusalem could be taken. It had not answered how Jerusalem could be held. Because the capture of the city did not close an age of conflict. It opened one.